The silence that follows a great loss is a language all its own. It doesn't scream or shout. It whispers in the hollow spaces a person leaves behind. It's in the empty chair at the dinner table, the unread newspaper on the armrest, the scent of pipe tobacco that you think you catch on the breeze, only for it to vanish. For me, that silence began the day my grandfather, Arthur, passed away. It settled over his small stone cottage in the heart of the Cotswolds, a place he called Rosevine Cottage, and it settled deep within my soul. My name is Alara, and for all of my 34 years, Arthur had been my compass, my anchor, and my truest friend. My own parents, Richard and Helen, were different. They lived in London, in a world of polished chrome, minimalist art, and conversations that skimmed the surface of life like dragonflies on a pond. Their love was conditional, a currency exchanged for achievements and appearances. Growing up, their house felt like a showroom, cold and immaculate. Affection was a scheduled event, a stiff hug before bed, a perfunctory, well done for a good report card. I always felt like a guest in their lives, a line item on their list of responsibilities. But Rosevine Cottage was another universe entirely. It was my sanctuary, my real home. The moment I'd step over the threshold, the sterile scent of London would be washed away by the rich aroma of wood polish, old books, and the faint, sweet smell of the roses that climbed the walls outside. Grandpa Arthur was a man carved from the same gentle, sturdy stuff as the ancient oaks in the nearby woods. His hands, though gnarled with age and the work of a lifetime spent as a master woodcarver, were the gentlest I had ever known. He taught me everything that mattered. He taught me how to listen to the birds and know their calls, how to plant a garden that would bloom in defiant color, how to see the stories hidden in a piece of raw timber. When I was a little girl, struggling with the cold indifference of my parents, I would spend entire summers with him. He never tried to fix my problems with grand gestures or empty platitudes. Instead, he'd sit with me in his workshop, the air thick with the scent of cedar and pine, and he'd hand me a small block of wood and a sanding block. "Smooth the edges, Alara," he would say in his soft, rumbling voice. "You can't change the grain, but you can always smooth the edges." It was his philosophy for everything. Life gives you a rough piece of wood, full of knots and imperfections. You don't discard it. You work with it. You sand it, you shape it, you find the beauty that was always there, waiting to be revealed. He saw that beauty in me, even when I couldn't see it in myself. My parents saw a quiet, overly sensitive child who didn't fit their mold of a bold, ambitious daughter. Grandpa Arthur saw a thoughtful soul who simply felt the world more deeply. He was my confidant. I told him about the loneliness I felt at boarding school, about the sting of my mother's casual criticisms about my weight or my choice of drab clothing. He would just listen, his blue eyes, crinkled at the corners from a lifetime of smiling, fixed on mine. He wouldn't badmouth my parents. That wasn't his way. He would simply offer a different perspective. "Your parents see the world through a different window, love," he once told me, as we sat by the fire, mugs of hot cocoa warming our hands. "Their view is of a busy street, full of traffic and noise. Your window looks out onto the garden. It doesn't make one view right and the other wrong, just different. Don't be angry that they can't see your flowers. Just keep tending to your garden." And I did. My garden was my relationship with him. It was the long walks we took, the stories he told of his own youth during the war, the quiet companionship that needed no words. He was a man of simple means, but immense wealth and spirit. The cottage wasn't grand, but every inch of it was filled with love. The wobbly leg on the kitchen table was the first thing he ever built. The intricate mantelpiece above the fireplace depicted a scene of the local village, each tiny person carved with impossible detail. His life was in that house. His soul was in its very walls. When he started to grow frail, it was a slow, heartbreaking dimming of a brilliant light. I moved back from my small flat in Oxford and took up residence in the spare room of the cottage to care for him. My parents would call, their conversations brief and practical. "Is the nurse coming on time? Have you sorted his finances? Make sure you get a proper power of attorney, Alara." There was never a "how is he feeling?" or, more importantly, "how are you, Alara?" It was as if they were managing a project, not witnessing the slow departure of a father and grandfather. Those last few months were some of the most profound of my life. The roles reversed. I was the one making him tea, reading to him from his favorite poetry books, helping him from his chair to his bed. The physical strength left his body, but the clarity of his mind and the warmth of his spirit remained. We talked for hours, not about death, but about life. About the joy of a perfect sunset, the satisfaction of a job well done, the enduring power of love. One evening, his breathing was shallow, and he held my hand with a surprising strength. "Alara," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "This cottage, it's more than wood and stone. It's a heart. It's my heart. And I'm giving it to you." I hushed him, telling him not to talk like that, but he squeezed my hand tighter. "No, you listen. Your parents, they won't understand. They see value only in what can be sold. But you understand the true worth of things. Promise me. Promise me you'll keep the heart beating." Tears streamed down my face as I looked into his fading eyes. "I promise, Grandpa. I promise." He smiled, a faint, peaceful expression. It was the last smile he ever gave. He passed away in his sleep 2 nights later, leaving behind a silence so vast and so absolute that I thought it might swallow me whole. The funeral was a blur. My parents stood beside me, looking appropriately somber, accepting condolences with a practiced grace. But I could feel their impatience, a subtle vibration of eagerness just beneath the surface. They were waiting for the formalities to be over, for the next phase to begin, the reading of the will. I clung to the memory of my promise, a tiny, flickering candle in the crushing darkness of my grief. I had no idea that the storm was yet to come, and that the very people who should have been my shelter were about to become the hurricane. The day of the will reading felt unnaturally cold for an autumn afternoon. We gathered in a sterile, wood-paneled solicitor's office in a nearby town. The air was thick with a tension that felt sharp enough to cut. My parents, Richard and Helen, sat opposite me, their faces composed, expectant. I just felt numb, my grief a heavy cloak I couldn't shrug off. My grandfather's solicitor, a kind, elderly man named Mr. Davies, who had known Arthur for 40 years, cleared his throat and began to read. The language was formal, full of legal jargon, but the message was simple and clear. A few small monetary gifts were left to old friends and neighbors. Some of his tools were bequeathed to a local youth woodworking club. And then came the final, most significant part. Mr. Davies paused, looking over his spectacles at me, then at my parents. "And as to the residue of my estate, including my property known as Rosevine Cottage, its contents, and all my remaining savings, I give, devise, and bequeath everything, absolutely and without condition, to my beloved granddaughter, Alara Grace Millington." The silence that followed was entirely different from the one left by grief. This was a sharp, brittle silence, pregnant with shock and fury. I looked up and saw my mother's face, a mask of disbelief hardening into a skull. My father's jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle pulsed in his cheek. He stared at me, not with sadness or disappointment, but with an open, undisguised hostility that made me feel like I'd been struck. "That's impossible," my mother, Helen, said, her voice a low hiss. "There must be some mistake." Mr. Davies shook his head slowly. "The will is perfectly clear, Helen. It was signed, witnessed, and Arthur was of completely sound mind." We discussed it at length. Sound mind, my father, Richard, scoffed, finally finding his voice. It was a sound dripping with contempt. He was an old man. She was there every day, whispering in his ear. "This is her doing." He pointed a finger at me, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of fear. "Richard, that is a very serious accusation," Mr. Davies warned, his tone becoming firm. But my father was beyond reason. The veneer of civility had cracked, and the raw greed beneath was spilling out. "It's obvious what happened. She preyed on a lonely old man. She manipulated him, turned him against his own son. For what? For a rundown cottage and a pittance of savings. It wasn't a pittance to him," I whispered, my voice trembling. "It was his life." "Oh, spare me the sentimental nonsense, Alara," my mother snapped, her eyes like chips of ice. "We know what this is about. You knew we planned to sell that place. It's prime Cotswolds real estate. It's worth a fortune. A fortune you have just stolen from this family." The word stolen hung in the air, ugly and venomous. They saw the cottage not as a home, not as the repository of our family's history, but as a cash machine. They weren't mourning the loss of a father, they were mourning the loss of a windfall. The grief in my heart curdled into a cold, hard knot of anger and disbelief. These were my parents, the people who were supposed to protect me. And they were looking at me as if I were a criminal. The meeting ended abruptly. They stormed out of the office, throwing parting shots over their shoulders about getting proper legal advice and not letting this injustice stand. I sat there, stunned into silence, the will clutched in my hand. Mr. Davies looked at me with deep sympathy. "I am so sorry, Alara. Arthur feared this might happen. He told me they never understood the value of anything they couldn't count." I went back to the cottage, the silence now feeling menacing. Every shadow seemed to hold the echo of their accusations. Had I done something wrong? The question, planted by their venom, began to sprout like a toxic weed in my mind. Had my love for my grandfather been a form of manipulation? I looked around at the home he had entrusted to me, the worn armchair where he sat, the bookshelf filled with his favorite poets, the half-finished carving of a small bird on his workbench. This wasn't a prize I had won, it was a legacy I had been given, a heart I had promised to keep beating. 2 weeks later, the official letter arrived. It was thick, cream-colored paper, embossed with the name of a high-powered London law firm. My hands shook as I opened it. The words swam before my eyes, cold and clinical. Contesting the last will and testament, grounds of undue influence, lack of testamentary capacity. They were suing me. Their own daughter. They were dragging my grandfather's name, my name, and our entire relationship through the mud of a courtroom. They were trying to prove that the purest love I had ever known was a lie, a calculated scheme to steal their inheritance. The months that followed were a living nightmare. The world, which had already lost its color with Grandpa Arthur's passing, now seemed to be closing in on me in shades of gray. I had to hire a solicitor of my own, a woman named Mrs. Gable, who was practical and kind but warned me that these cases could become incredibly nasty. The legal fees began to mount, eating away at the savings my grandfather had left me, the very savings my parents were ironically trying to claim. The process of discovery was the worst part. I had to turn over years of personal emails, letters, and even my own private journals to their legal team. They were searching for any scrap of evidence they could twist. A line in a diary where I'd mentioned being frustrated with my parents became proof of a long-held animosity. A thank you card from my grandfather for a gift I'd bought him was framed as incurring favor. My entire life, my most private thoughts and feelings were being dissected by strangers, all in service of my parents' greed. The worst was the deposition. I had to sit in a conference room for 8 hours while their barrister, a man with a cruel, thin smile, questioned me relentlessly. He twisted my words, misrepresented my actions. "Miss Millington, isn't it true that you moved into your grandfather's home a full 6 months before he altered his will in your favor?" I moved in to care for him. He was ill. Conveniently ill, wouldn't you say? It gave you unfettered access, day and night, to a vulnerable elderly man. He wasn't vulnerable. He was my grandfather. I loved him. So you say. But this love resulted in you inheriting an estate worth, by our estimation, in excess of £1 million. A rather profitable love, wouldn't you agree? I left that room feeling violated, stripped bare. They had taken the most sacred relationship of my life and painted it as a sordid transaction. I would go back to the cottage at night, walking through the quiet rooms, and I would talk to him as if he were there. "What do I do, Grandpa?" I'd whisper into the darkness. "They're trying to destroy everything. They're trying to make our love ugly." And in the silence, I would almost hear his voice, calm and steady. "Smooth the edges, Alara. You can't change the grain." The grain of my parents' character was coarse and knotted with avarice. I couldn't change that, but I could hold on to the truth. I could smooth the edges of my own fear and pain and prepare to fight, not for a house, but for his memory. As the court date loomed, Mrs. Gable told me to gather anything that demonstrated the nature of my relationship with my grandfather. I spent days sifting through old boxes in the attic. I found photographs of me as a toddler on his shoulders, crayon drawings I'd made for him, and stacks of letters he had sent me at boarding school. Each one was a testament to his unwavering love. He wrote about the goings-on in the village, the progress of his latest carving, but mostly he wrote to tell me he was proud of me, that he believed in me. In a small, velvet-lined box, I found the most precious thing of all. It was a locket he had made for me on my 16th birthday. It wasn't gold or silver, but carved from a single piece of dark, lustrous walnut wood. The front was an incredibly intricate carving of a single rose, its petals so delicate they looked as if they might be real. Inside, on one side, was a tiny picture of him, and on the other, a tiny picture of me. I remembered the day he gave it to me. "A rose for my English rose," he'd said, his eyes twinkling. "And so you can always keep us close to your heart." I decided then and there that I would wear it to court. It was my armor. It was the truth carved in wood. I had no idea that this small, heartfelt gift from a lifetime ago would end up changing everything. The courtroom was exactly as I had imagined it, imposing, cold, and utterly devoid of warmth. The dark wood of the benches and the judge's dais seemed to absorb all the light, and the air hummed with a low, anxious energy. I sat beside my solicitor, Mrs. Gable, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles were white. Across the aisle, my parents sat with their barrister. They wouldn't look at me. They stared straight ahead, their faces set like stone, as if I were a complete stranger. In that moment, I suppose I was. The judge entered. His name was Judge Alistair Croft. He was an older man, perhaps in his late 60s, with a sweep of silver hair and a face that seemed etched with a deep, thoughtful seriousness. He looked over the courtroom with eyes that missed nothing, and my heart hammered against my ribs. This man held my past, my present, and my future in his hands. The proceedings began. My parents' barrister stood and painted a masterful, poisonous picture. He portrayed me as a cunning, manipulative opportunist. He spoke of my estrangement from my hardworking parents, my lack of a serious career, and my sudden and intense interest in my grandfather's welfare as he neared the end of his life. He presented financial documents, twisting my part-time work into unemployment and my modest lifestyle into desperation for funds. My parents were called to the stand. My father spoke of his deep love for Arthur, a love I had supposedly sabotaged. He talked about phone calls I didn't pass on, visits I discouraged. They were all lies, subtle and clever distortions of the truth, but in the sterile environment of the court, they sounded plausible. Then my mother took the stand. This was harder. She cried. They were not, I knew, tears of grief for her father, but tears of self-pity. She spoke of her dream to have the family closer, a dream I had shattered. She described finding me going through my grandfather's financial papers, reframing an instance where I was helping him pay his bills into a scene of me snooping for assets. "We just wanted what was fair," she sobbed, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. "For his estate to be shared by his family. But Ilara wanted it all for herself." The narrative was complete. I was the greedy, heartless usurper, and they were the grieving, wronged family. I could feel the atmosphere in the room shift. People were looking at me with suspicion, with pity for my parents. Finally, it was my turn. My legs felt like lead as I walked to the witness stand. Mrs. Gable gave me a small, encouraging nod. As I sat down, my hand instinctively went to the wooden locket hanging around my neck. Its smooth, familiar surface was a small point of stillness in a swirling sea of fear. Mrs. Gable began her questioning gently, allowing me to tell my story. I didn't speak of legal points or finances. I spoke of my grandpa. I talked about the scent of his workshop. I described the patience in his hands as he taught me to carve my first, clumsy-looking wooden boat. I talked about the summers spent weeding his garden and the winters spent reading by his fire. I explained that caring for him in his final months wasn't a burden or a strategy. It was the single greatest privilege of my life. "They say I influenced him," I said, my voice shaking but clear. I looked towards the judge, wanting him, more than anyone, to understand. And they are right. I did. I influenced him to laugh when he was in pain. I influenced him to eat when he had no appetite. I influenced him to tell me one more story before he went to sleep. And he influenced me. He influenced me to be kind, to be patient, to see the value in things that can't be bought or sold. That was the nature of our influence. It was called love. Tears were now streaming down my face, but I didn't wipe them away. My parents see that cottage, and they see a property price. They see pound signs. When I see that cottage, I see the notch on the door frame where my grandfather marked my height every year. I see the worn patch on the carpet where his armchair sat. I see the window I looked through while waiting for his car to come up the lane. They want to sell it, to liquidate it. But you cannot liquidate a memory. You cannot put a price on a soul. They are not just asking for his money. They are asking this court to give them permission to erase him. And I cannot. I promised him I would not let that happen. I finished, my whole body trembling with the force of my emotion. The courtroom was utterly silent. My parents' barrister rose, a smirk on his face, ready to tear my testimony apart. But before he could speak, Judge Croft held up a hand. "One moment, counsel," the judge said, his voice quiet but commanding. He was looking at me, his gaze fixed not on my face, but on the locket at my neck. "Miss Millington," he said, his tone softening slightly. "May I ask you about the pendant you are wearing?" I was taken aback. It's a locket, Your Honor. My grandfather made it for me." "He carved it himself?" the judge asked, leaning forward slightly. "Yes, from walnut wood, for my 16th birthday." Judge Croft stared at it for a long moment, a strange, unreadable expression on his face. He seemed to be looking at something far beyond the courtroom walls. He then turned his gaze to my parents, and the warmth was gone, replaced by an unnerving coolness. He cleared his throat. "I believe I have heard enough," he announced, causing a stir in the room. "I am ready to deliver my judgment." My parents' barrister started to protest, but the judge silenced him with a look. He began by addressing the legal points, dissecting the claims of undue influence with sharp, incisive logic. He noted the multiple witnesses, including Mr. Davies and my grandfather's doctor, who testified to Arthur's sharp mind and clear intentions. He dismantled the narrative my parents had so carefully constructed. And then he paused, and his voice took on a deeply personal tone. "The law is often a blunt instrument when it comes to matters of the heart," he said, looking directly at me. "But sometimes, a small detail can illuminate the entire truth. I am a hobbyist woodworker myself. A very, very amateur one. Decades ago, when I was a young, struggling lawyer with a new family, I nearly gave it up. It felt like a frivolous waste of time and money. Then my father sent me an article from a craftsman's magazine. It was an interview with a master woodcarver from the Cotswolds, a man named Arthur Millington." A collective gasp went through the room. My own heart stopped. "The article wasn't just about technique," the judge continued, his voice resonating with old memories. "It was about philosophy. He spoke of how each piece of wood has its own story, its own soul. He spoke of his work not as a job, but as a way of honoring the life of the tree it came from. He said, and I have never forgotten it, we leave behind not what is engraved in stone monuments, but what is woven into the lives of others." That man, Arthur Millington, and his words inspired me to continue with my hobby, which has brought me immense peace and joy throughout my life. I never met him, but he influenced me from afar. He picked up his gavel, but he didn't bang it. He held it and looked at my parents, his eyes filled with a profound disappointment that was more damning than any anger. "You have come before this court asking for what you believe is your rightful inheritance. But it is clear to me that Arthur Millington's true inheritance was never the cottage or the money in his bank account. His true legacy is one of character, of kindness, of seeing the beauty and worth in things that are not for sale. A legacy he worked his entire life to build." He then turned his gaze to me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of a smile in his eyes. And it is a legacy that he has successfully passed down, in its entirety, to his granddaughter. I see it in her testimony, and I see it carved into the very locket she wears around her neck. The case is dismissed. The will of Arthur Millington stands. It was over. The sound of the gavel finally striking the wood was like a thunderclap. My parents sat frozen, their faces pale with shock and humiliation. Mrs. Gable squeezed my arm, tears in her own eyes. I felt a wave of relief so immense it almost brought me to my knees. It wasn't a feeling of victory, not of triumph. It was the feeling of a storm finally passing, leaving behind a clean, quiet stillness. I walked out of the courtroom and didn't look back. I didn't need to. I drove home to the Cotswolds, to Rosevine Cottage. As I unlocked the front door, the familiar scent of wood and roses and history washed over me. The silence was still there, but it was no longer heavy with grief or fear. It was a peaceful silence now, a knowing silence. I walked into my grandfather's workshop and ran my hand over his workbench, over the half-finished bird. I had kept my promise. The heart of the cottage was still beating. And in the quiet of my own heart, I knew that my grandfather's true inheritance wasn't something I owned, but something I would now spend the rest of my life becoming. I was his story continuing. And that was a treasure no court could ever touch, and no amount of money could ever buy. A courtroom victory doesn't feel the way you think it will. There is no triumphant music, no sudden lifting of all burdens. It feels more like the moment after a violent storm has passed. The destructive winds have died down, the thunder is gone, but the air is heavy with the scent of rain and broken branches, and you are left standing in the wreckage, surveying what has been lost. The case was dismissed, and Rosevine Cottage was mine, legally and unequivocally. But in the process, the family I was born into had been irrevocably shattered. I had won my grandfather's house, but I had lost my parents. Though a quiet, honest voice in the back of my mind whispered, had I ever really had them at all? The first few weeks were a strange, hollow existence. I would wake up in my grandfather's cottage, the morning light streaming through the familiar windows, and for a blissful second, I would forget. I'd almost expect to hear the shuffle of his slippers or the whistle of the kettle. Then memory would crash down upon me, a twofold wave of grief, one for the grandfather I missed with every fiber of my being, and a newer, sharper grief for the parents who were still alive but were now more lost to me than he was. The villagers in the small Cotswold community were kind but cautious. News travels fast in a place like this, and the story of the London son suing his own daughter over old Arthur Millington's cottage had become local legend. They treated me with a gentle, pitying respect, as if I were recovering from a long illness. Beatrice, the warm, rosy-cheeked woman who ran the village tea shop, became my lifeline. She would insist I come in for a pot of tea and a scone, refusing any payment. Arthur paid for this years ago with his friendship, love, she'd say, her voice as comforting as a warm blanket. She'd sit with me at a small corner table, away from the prying ears of other customers, and let me talk, or just let me be silent. She had known my grandfather since she was a girl. Your parents, she said one afternoon, stirring her tea thoughtfully, they were always visitors here, Alara. Even when they were children. They saw the country, but they never felt it. Arthur, he was the soil itself. And you, my dear, you have his roots. Her words were a comfort, but the nights were still long. The silence of the cottage, once so peaceful, now felt accusatory. Had I done enough? Was I living up to my promise to keep its heart beating? I felt adrift, a ship that had weathered the storm but now had no map and no destination. I would wander into his workshop, the scent of cedar and sawdust a painful, beautiful reminder. His tools lay on the benches, gleaming faintly in the moonlight, waiting for a hand that would never hold them again. His last, unfinished project, the small, intricately detailed bird, sat on the workbench, its wings half spread as if frozen mid-flight. I felt just like that bird, poised to fly, but unable to move. About a month after the court case, a thick envelope arrived, bearing the official seal of the judiciary. My heart seized, a residual panic from the lawsuit flaring up. But the return address was the personal chambers of Judge Alastair Croft. With trembling hands, I opened it. Inside was not a legal document, but a handwritten letter on heavy, cream-colored card. Dear Miss Millington, it began, the handwriting elegant and precise. I hope you will forgive this unprofessional intrusion, but I felt compelled to write. Your grandfather's words have been a quiet companion to me for many years, but seeing his legacy so beautifully and fiercely defended in your testimony was a profound experience. You did not simply defend a will, you defended a way of life, a philosophy of grace and integrity that is all too rare in this world. In the noise and fury of my profession, it is easy to forget that justice is not always found in legal precedent, but in the truth of a human heart. You reminded me of that. I have enclosed a copy of the old magazine article I mentioned. I thought you might like to have it. I wish you nothing but peace and happiness in the home your grandfather so wisely left to you. He knew the wood had a good grain. Sincerely, Alistair Croft. Tucked behind the letter was a carefully preserved, yellowed copy of the article. There was a black and white photograph of a much younger Grandpa Arthur, his face joyful, his hands covered in wood shavings. And there was the quote the judge had recited, the one that had echoed in my soul. We leave behind not what is engraved in stone monuments, but what is woven into the lives of others. I sat at the kitchen table, the letter in one hand and the article in the other, and I cried. But these were not tears of grief or anger. They were tears of release. The judge, a man of power and stature, a complete stranger, had seen the truth. He had seen my grandfather's light, and he had seen it reflected in me. It was the ultimate validation, a final, resounding confirmation that my love had been pure, my fight had been just. And in his words, I found my map, woven into the lives of others. That was it. That was the answer. Keeping the heart of the cottage beating didn't mean preserving it like a museum. It meant allowing its spirit to flow outwards, to touch others, just as my grandfather had touched the judge's life from afar. I looked at the unfinished bird on the workbench. It was time to help it fly. The next morning, I woke with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since before Arthur fell ill. I walked into the workshop, but instead of feeling the pang of loss, I felt a surge of energy. I tied my hair back, put on one of my grandfather's old work aprons, and I began to clean. I dusted every surface, organized every tool, swept away the cobwebs of inactivity and sorrow. I opened the great wooden doors of the workshop to the world, letting the sunlight and fresh air pour in, chasing out the last of the stale shadows. Then I began to work. I picked up the little bird. My own carving skills were rudimentary at best, a clumsy echo of my grandfather's genius. But I remembered what he taught me. Smooth the edges. I didn't try to finish the intricate feathers. I just took a fine grit sandpaper and began to smooth the wood, following the lines he had started, feeling the form take shape under my fingers. It was a meditation. With every stroke, I felt like I was sanding away the rough edges of my own pain. A few days later, a young boy from the village, no older than 12, peeked his head around the open workshop doors. His name was Leo, a quiet lad I'd seen around. "Is it true your granddad could make anything out of wood?" he asked, his eyes wide with awe. "He was pretty magical," I smiled. "I wish I could do that," he said wistfully, looking at the tools. An idea sparked in my mind, bright and clear. "Would you like to learn?" I asked. Leo's face lit up. "Really?" And so it began. Every Tuesday and Thursday after school, Leo would come to the workshop. I started him just as my grandfather had started me, with a block of soft pine and a piece of sandpaper. I taught him about the grain, about patience, about how to listen to the wood. Soon, an elderly man named George, a retired postal worker who had recently lost his wife, began stopping by. He didn't want to carve. He just wanted to sit and watch, to be in a space that felt productive and peaceful. He'd bring a flask of tea and tell me stories about his wife's garden. I put a small, hand-carved sign outside the cottage gate. It didn't say lessons or business. It just said, "The Rosevine Workshop. All are welcome." People started to come. A young mother who needed an hour to herself, who found a strange therapy in learning how to sand a simple box smooth. A teenager struggling at school who discovered he had a knack for wood turning. The workshop, once the solitary domain of one man, was now filled with a gentle hum of activity, of quiet concentration, of shared stories and budding friendships. It was no longer silent. It was alive with the sound of new lives being woven into its history. I wasn't making money, I was making connections. The cottage was becoming a heart for the village, just as Grandpa Arthur had been. One crisp autumn afternoon, about a year after the court case, I was helping Leo put the finishing touches on a small, wobbly-legged stool he had made for his mother. The phone rang in the house. I wiped my hands and went to answer it, my heart giving a familiar, anxious lurch when I saw the London number. It was my mother. Her voice was strange, hesitant, stripped of its usual sharp authority. "Alara," she said. "Your father and I, we were hoping we could come and see you. This weekend." I was speechless. I hadn't heard from either of them since the day in court. They had sent no letters, made no calls. There had been no apology, just a vast, condemning silence from their end. "Why?" I asked, the single word holding a universe of pain. We want to talk." "To try and fix things," she said, the words sounding rehearsed and unnatural. "Please, Alara. It's important." Against my better judgment, a tiny, foolish flicker of hope ignited within me. Maybe the judge's words had affected them. Maybe the shame and the time apart had given them perspective. "All right," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Saturday." They arrived on Saturday afternoon. They looked older, more tired than I remembered. They brought an expensive bouquet of flowers that looked garishly out of place in the cottage's simple, rustic charm. They walked in, looking around with an awkward, assessing gaze. "The place looks, well, you've kept it clean," my father said, as if giving a performance review. We sat in the living room, the silence stretching uncomfortably. They spoke of the shame of the court case, of how people in their social circle had heard whispers. Their regret seemed to be rooted in their own public humiliation, not in the pain they had caused me. Then, my mother's eyes landed on a small, beautifully finished music box on the mantelpiece, one that George, the retired postman, had painstakingly repaired. "That's a lovely piece," she said, getting up to touch it. "Is it valuable?" And in that one question, I saw it all. Nothing had changed. They were still seeing the world through the same window, the one that looked out onto a busy street where everything had a price tag. They hadn't come to mend my heart, they had come to inspect my assets. "I need to show you something," I said, standing up. I led them not through the house, but outside and into the workshop. Leo and George were there, working quietly on their respective projects. They looked up as we entered. I introduced them, and my parents gave them tight, polite smiles, clearly uncomfortable. I stood in the middle of the room, the scent of wood and fellowship all around me, and I turned to face them. "This is what I'm doing with my inheritance," I said, my voice quiet but strong. "Grandpa's legacy isn't the monetary value of this property. It's this. It's community. It's purpose. It's taking something raw and giving it beauty and a place in the world." My father looked around, bewildered. "It's a hobby club, Alara. You've turned a prime piece of real estate into a community center. This isn't what He stopped, catching himself. "What you what?" I pressed gently. "What you would have done." "I know. You would have sold it. You would have taken the money and bought another car, another holiday, another thing to fill the space where a feeling is supposed to be. You came here today thinking you could fix things. But you can't fix something you refuse to understand." My mother started to cry, the same performative tears from the courtroom. "But we're your family, Alara." I looked at her, and for the first time, I felt not anger, not pain, but a deep, profound pity. "Families shouldn't have to sue each other to be heard," I said softly. I walked over to the workbench and picked up the small wooden bird. It was now perfectly smooth, its grain glowing, its wings ready. "I forgive you," I said, and I meant it. The anger had long since been sanded away. "I forgive you for not being the parents I needed. But forgiveness isn't the same as trust. It isn't an open door. I have a life here now. A real one. Full of people who value what's inside. And I can't let you break it." I placed the bird in my mother's hand. This was the last thing he ever touched. Maybe if you look at it long enough, you'll start to see what he saw. They left soon after, quietly. There were no more arguments. They walked away from the workshop, past the hand-carved sign, and out of my life, this time for good. I watched them go, and I felt a sense of finality, of peace. The storm was truly over. I turned back to the warmth and light of the workshop, where Leo was showing George his finished stool. The heart of the cottage was beating, stronger than ever. It was woven not just into my life, but into the lives of many. My grandfather's story was not over. It had simply found new pages to be written on. And I was finally free to write my own chapter. Watching my parents' car disappear down the lane was like watching the tide recede from a shore that had been battered by a hurricane. It left behind a landscape that was forever altered. There was debris, yes, the jagged pieces of a broken family, the hollow ache of a childhood that now officially had no hope of redemption. But there was also a vast, quiet, and profound sense of calm. The storm had finally, truly passed. I stood there in the gravel driveway, the cool evening air on my cheeks, until the red of their tail lights was completely swallowed by the twilight. I had not won a battle. I had simply chosen to leave the battlefield. I turned and walked back toward the workshop. The warm, yellow light spilled out from the open doors, a beacon in the gathering dark. Inside, Leo was showing George how to use a wood rasp, his young face a mask of serious concentration. George, in turn, was listening with the patient respect one gives a true teacher. The air smelled of sawdust, tea, and companionship. This was my sanctuary. This was my truth. The cold emptiness my parents had left behind in the driveway could not penetrate this space. I took off my coat, hung it on its peg, and picked up a piece of sandpaper. As I sat down, George looked over at me, his kind eyes searching my face. He didn't ask what had happened. He simply pushed a mug of still warm tea towards me. In that small, silent gesture, there was more family than I had ever felt in my parents' pristine London flat. The seasons turned. Autumn bled its fiery colors into the stark white of winter, and then winter softened into the tender green of spring. The Rosevine workshop became a quiet, constant rhythm in the life of the village. It was never crowded, never loud. It was a place of gentle purpose. Beatrice from the tea shop closed up an hour early on Wednesdays to come and learn how to repair the wobbly legs on her cafe chairs. A young woman named Chloe, a graphic designer who worked from home and was starved for tangible creation, discovered a love for making intricate little boxes. The workshop's community grew not by design, but by need, like wildflowers finding a patch of fertile ground. I grew along with it. My hands, once soft and uncertain, became capable. They learned the language of different woods, the heft of a chisel, the satisfying rasp of a well-used plane. I was no longer just sanding my grandfather's work, I was beginning my own. My first projects were clumsy, a crooked picture frame, a slightly lopsided bowl. But with each mistake, I heard my grandfather's voice, not chiding, but encouraging. Find the beauty in the imperfection, Alara. That's where the character lives. My grief for him didn't vanish, but it changed its shape. It was no longer a crushing weight, but a soft, warm cloak of memory that I wore comfortably. He was in the tools I held, the advice I passed on to Leo, the very air I breathed in his workshop. One sunny afternoon in late spring, more than 2 years after the court case, a modest car I didn't recognize pulled up to the cottage. An older gentleman with silver hair and a kind, familiar face stepped out. He wore casual trousers and a simple jacket, looking for all the world like a tourist who had taken a wrong turn. But I knew him instantly. It was Judge Alistair Croft. My heart did a nervous flutter, but it was a different kind of nervousness than I'd felt in his courtroom. He walked towards the open workshop doors, a look of quiet reverence on his face. "I hope you don't mind," he said, his voice as calm and measured as I remembered. I was holidaying nearby, and I couldn't resist. I had to see the place where the magic happened. I wiped my dusty hands on my apron, a smile spreading across my face. "Judge Croft, it's an honor. Please come in." "Alistair, please," he insisted, stepping inside. His eyes took in everything, the people working quietly, the rows of tools, the scent of wood and polish. He looked at me, then around the room, and a slow, genuine smile lit up his face. "So this is it. This is what you've done. It's even better than I imagined." I showed him around, introducing him to Chloe and an old farmer named Sam who was meticulously carving a handle for a walking stick. The judge spoke to everyone with an easy grace, asking about their projects with the genuine interest of a fellow enthusiast. He felt less like a judge and more like a pilgrim who had finally reached his destination. We ended up by the main workbench. His eyes scanned the surface and then landed on the empty space where the unfinished bird used to sit. He didn't ask directly, but his gaze was questioning. "The bird," I said softly, understanding his unasked question. "I gave it away." He looked at me, his expression thoughtful. A difficult thing to part with, I imagine. It was, I admitted. But it was a piece of him that belonged somewhere else. Sometimes you have to let things go to truly keep what matters. He nodded slowly, a deep understanding in his eyes. A wisdom Arthur Millington himself would have appreciated. He reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small, cloth-wrapped object. "I brought you something. It's not much, certainly not the work of a master. But I carved it while thinking about your grandfather's words and about your testimony that day." He unwrapped it and placed it in my hand. It was a small, simple carving of a key. It wasn't ornate or perfect. I could see the slight imperfections of an amateur's hand. But it was smooth, and it was made from a beautiful piece of wood, its heartwood a warm orange. It felt solid and real in my palm. "You don't just keep his legacy," Alistair said gently. "You have unlocked it for others. You have given them a key to a part of themselves they might not have found. I thought you should have one of your own." Tears welled in my eyes as I closed my hand around the small wooden key. It was the most beautiful gift I had ever received. It was a circle completed. My grandfather's spirit had reached out across the years to inspire a young lawyer, and now that man, a judge, had returned to bring a gift that affirmed the continuation of that very spirit. He didn't stay long. He wished me well, shook my hand warmly, and was gone, leaving as quietly as he had arrived. I stood in the workshop doorway, holding the wooden key, and looked at the life I was now living. I heard Chloe's quiet laughter as Sam told her a long-winded story. I saw Leo, now a lanky teenager, showing a new visitor how to hold a block of wood in the vise. I thought of my parents. I hadn't heard from them again, and I didn't expect to. The carved bird I had given them was likely sitting in a drawer somewhere, its meaning lost on them, its value unappreciated. And I was okay with that. My forgiveness had been for me, not for them. It was the key that had unlocked my own heart from the prison of their expectations. I walked back to the workbench and placed Alistair Croft's wooden key in the spot where my grandfather's bird had once sat. It looked right. It looked like it belonged. The story was no longer about what was lost, but about what was being built day by day, piece by piece. My grandfather had left me a cottage of wood and stone, but his true gift was something far more profound. He had taught me that a home is not a structure you inherit, but a community you create. It's not a place you're given, but a feeling you build with open hands and an open heart. The evening light slanted through the workshop, illuminating the dancing dust motes like tiny, golden stars. The sound of gentle sanding was the only music. The silence of loss had been replaced by the quiet hum of life. My inheritance wasn't the cottage I was given, it was the home I had built. And it was more beautiful than I could ever have imagined.